I like this, to hit.
Do you want to declare the sitting open?
The first item of business this morning is the debate on the report titled The Honoring of Membership Obligations to the Council of Europe by Malta, presented by Mr. Fournier and Mr. Lukaides on behalf of the Monitoring Committee. In order to allow time for the second debate this morning, I will interrupt the list of speakers at about 10:40 to allow time for the reply and vote. We will begin with Mr. Fournier and Mr. Lukaides, co-rapporteurs. Dear colleagues, you have 5 minutes each. First, I call Mr. Fournier. Mr. Fournier, you have the floor.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, mes chers collègues, nous examinons aujourd'hui le rapport sur le respect des obligations de Malte en tant que membre de notre Assemblée. Ce rapport a été préparé par la Commission de suivi dans le cadre de l'examen périodique des obligations d'adhésion des États membres du Conseil de l'Europe qui ne sont pas soumis à une procédure de suivi complète. Ce rapport et le projet de résolution donnent une vue d'ensemble du fonctionnement des institutions démocratiques et de l'état de droit du pays, de ses réalisations à cet égard, des défis auxquels elles sont confrontées et des recommandations sur la manière dont ces questions pourraient être traitées. Malte est une société dynamique, vivante et interconnectée, mais aussi une société très polarisée. Ces dernières années, cette société a été secouée par un certain nombre de crises, notamment, il faut le dire, l'assassinat de Daphne Caruana Galizia, qui ont mis en évidence de graves lacunes et insuffisances dans le système d'équilibre des pouvoirs institutionnels du pays, ainsi que dans le fonctionnement des institutions de l'état de droit. Ces lacunes ont été examinées en détail par l'Assemblée dans le cadre du rapport de M. Homsing sur l'assignation de Daphne Caruana Galizia et l'état de droit à Malte et au-delà, veiller à ce que toute la vérité émerge, fin de citation, ainsi que dans un certain nombre d'avis de la Commission de Venise. À la suite de la publication de ce rapport, les autorités et les forces politiques maltaises ont lancé un certain nombre de réformes très importantes qui ont permis de remédier à un certain nombre de lacunes constatées. Il s'agit d'une avancée importante qui doit être saluée. Toutefois, dans le même temps, ces réformes ne répondent que partiellement aux déficiences. Une réforme complète et véritablement holistique des institutions démocratiques et du système d'équilibre des pouvoirs de Malte est toujours nécessaire et urgente. Ceci est d'autant plus important dans le contexte de la polarisation politique et sociale profondément enracinée à Malte, déjà mentionnée, qui imprègne presque tous les aspects de la société maltaise et qui met en danger le fonctionnement de ses institutions démocratiques. La nécessité d'une telle réforme globale est largement partagée dans la société maltaise elle-même. La mise en place d'une assemblée constitutionnelle par le président maltais, que nous saluons vivement, en est la preuve. Il est maintenant important que cette convention constitutionnelle dispose d'un mandat clair et d'un calendrier strict pour achever ses travaux et qu'elle exécute ses tâches de manière consensuelle et sur la base, naturellement, d'un processus de consultation large et complet dans la société maltaise. Enfin, un élément clé d'une telle réforme globale devrait être une réforme complète du Parlement maltais en vue d'établir un Parlement à temps plein qui puisse assurer un contrôle parlementaire adéquat et reprendre l'initiative législative. Cet élément est crucial pour la réussite de la réforme du système institutionnel maltais, des freins et contrepoids. Cette recommandation est largement partagée, soutenue et même exigée dans la société maltaise et au-delà des lignes de partis politiques. Elle contribuera également à réduire la vulnérabilité du Parlement aux conflits d'intérêts et à la corruption. Cette vulnérabilité a été soulignée dans un certain nombre de rapports, notamment par le Gréco. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Now I call Mr. Lukaides. You have also 5 minutes. You have the floor.
Taking up from where my colleague left off, there is a second important theme in our report, namely the vulnerability of Malta's political and democratic institutions to conflicts of interest and corruption. The Independent Public Inquiry Commission that was established on recommendation of the Assembly concluded that in Malta there is a culture of impunity and institutional omerta, which undermines the proper functioning of the democratic and rule of law institutions. Again, while a number of welcoming initiatives have been taken by the authorities, more and more consistent efforts are needed to address this systemic vulnerability of Malta's democratic institutions. In this context, we recommend that the need and possibility for secondary employment for parliamentarians be considerably reduced and limited to a number of clearly circumscribed type of activities and appointed positions. In addition, the independence of the civil service needs to be further strengthened, and the number of political appointees in the civil service, so-called persons of trust, need to be drastically reduced and circumscribed as well. The report, dear colleagues, is mostly focusing on the functioning of the country's democratic and rule of law institutions, but is equally addressing a number of important human rights issues. Malta has a very well-established framework for the protection of the rights of the LGBTI persons, which should be lauded. At the same time, equality between men and women, despite some welcome progress, such as, for instance, the number of women elected to the parliament in the last elections, still leaves a lot to be desired and needs to be further enhanced. In this regard, it should be noted that Malta has one of the strictest abortion laws in Europe, which forbids abortion in all circumstances. Without wishing to enter into a debate about abortion, we wish to emphasize that reproductive rights and health are important and integral aspects of women's rights that need to be strengthened in Malta. Another issue has been the treatment of irregular migrants and asylum seekers. Malta is a Mediterranean frontline state with regard to migration and asylum seekers. The number of migrants and asylum seekers that arrive on Maltese shores are very high in comparison to Malta's small population. More and more consistent solidarity of other European states with Malta's difficult position in this respect is needed. And indeed, this is true with regard to all Mediterranean frontline states that face similar situations. That, notwithstanding, it is important that the Maltese authorities fully honor and respect their responsibilities and human rights obligations with regard to these migrants and asylum seekers. In this respect, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights has made a number of important recommendations with regard to the reception and treatment of migrants and asylum seekers that we fully second and urge the authorities to implement. Dear colleagues, we started our speech with a reference to Daphne Caruana Galicia's brutal assassination. Her assassination and the government's response to it brought the spotlight on numerous shortcomings with regard to Malta's institutional system of checks and balances and functioning of democratic institutions, which we have outlined in our report. However, in our report, we have explicitly not touched upon the investigation into her assassination itself. This has been dealt within the report of the Legal Affairs Committee. We fully support its conclusions and findings, and in our resolution, repeated the call upon the Maltese authorities to fully address the concerns and recommendations expressed in this report, as well as that by the Independent Public Inquiry Commission. I should also like, before ending, to thank the Maltese authorities for their collaboration and willingness to assist us throughout the whole procedure, and especially during our fact-finding mission to Malta. Lastly, dear colleagues, I should like to thank the Secretariat of the Monitoring Committee, but more particularly express our deep gratitude to Mr. Bas Klein, whose capabilities, expertise and support were invaluable. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now the representatives of the political groups. First, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Vardanyan on behalf of EPP.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, let me first of all congratulate rapporteurs for an excellent report. In 1965, 1 year after the independence, Malta became the 18th member of the Council of Europe, contributing to the achievements of our organization. Recently, the Republic of Malta appeared in the focus of the Parliamentary Assembly, predominantly in the context of assassination of anti-corruption journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. Assassination where still there are many questions which should be answered. Relevant resolutions of the Parliamentary Assembly as well as the Venice Commission adopted recently led Maltese authorities to undertake essential reforms to address the legal shortcomings existing in the country. The ongoing reforms are intended to increase the independence of the judiciary, to improve the checks and balances mechanism, to clarify the appointment procedure of official positions, to ameliorate civil service in Malta. The undertaken amelioration should be definitely welcomed. Nevertheless, they are necessary but not enough to create in Malta the environment of the respect to the rule of law, protection of human rights, and promotion of democracy and elimination of culture of impunity. Ladies and gentlemen, constitutional order is crucial for the establishment of the rule of law environment in the country. In this perspective, initiative taken into the direction of establishment of the Constitutional Assembly by the President of Malta should be welcomed. Constitutional amendments will approximate Malta's constitutional settings to the European standards. Addressing Malta's anti-corruption agenda, it is due to mention that some issues, especially concerning the conflict of interest, are still very alarming. There is no doubt that parliamentarian reform may also seriously contribute to the Maltese anti-corruption agenda, since the creation of the full-time professional parliament would be a crucial change for making political processes in Malta be more transparent and politicians be more accountable. It's necessary for preventing conflict of interest and misuse of parliamentarian mandates. I do believe that successful implementation of the reforms with the close cooperation with the Council of Europe will put an end to the culture of impunity in Malta. Thank you.
Next speaker, Mr. Howell, European Conservatives.
Thank you very much. When I first read this report, I was struck by how this is almost a classic monitoring report. It is very good indeed. And what I mean by that is that it has not sought to turn monitoring into a big stick with which to beat Malta, but it has set out very carefully to look at the way in which Malta is developing and how we can provide the assistance to allow Malta to develop further. And I think that that is a very important fact that we should all remember when we undertake monitoring exercises. We are not there to exercise our right to be able to wave the big stick at the country for doing certain things or not doing certain things. We are there to help it to be able to reach the future. And I detected more than a little bit of sympathy for Malta from the rapporteurs, which I think is to their credit. For example, when they talk about political institutions, they talk about vulnerable institutions. And it is that understanding of the vulnerability of institutions in Malta that I think makes this one of the classic reports. They too mention a very important issue, and that is the plight of women. And that goes hand in hand with the fact that Malta is a very conservative society. And although it has signed the Istanbul Convention, what we need to do is to make sure that a process of culture change takes place in order to improve the rights of women within Maltese society. There is no point in just signing a convention and then turning one's back on it and walking away and hoping that the best will occur from it. We need to help the country to develop the sort of society that we would like it to become, and to help it to be able to implement the important provisions within the Istanbul Convention. And the same applies to LGBT rights. One of the rapporteurs, I can't remember which, mentioned the importance of new up-to-date legislation on this subject. That too is very important. But that needs to be transferred through culture change to make sure that it applies equally across the whole of Maltese society. So I think in conclusion that this was a very good exercise, a very, very good monitoring exercise in which the rapporteurs have shown sympathy with the country and have gone out of their way to show how we can help it rather than just what it has done wrong.
Next speaker is Petra Stinen, ALDE.
Thank you, Mr. George Loukaitis and Mr. Fournier, for authoring this report. On behalf of the ALDE Group, I would like to especially join the position of this report in emphasizing the burden Malta is facing, one of the Mediterranean frontline states, with regard to migrants and asylum seekers, and the urgent necessity to intervene. We should all work together and at home to gather the European solidarity that Malta needs in order to deal with the arrival of North African migrants and refugees. It's high time to find a framework of support that works for all European frontline states with European support. Also, I have to notice that Malta proves again that having rights on paper doesn't always translate for women as well as for LGBTI people and other minorities into actual exercise of these rights. Since we have similar conversation in many European countries, I will closely follow the real-life effects of the legislation on increasing the representation of women in the new parliament and whether it will be followed by an increased representation in the executive bodies. In the ALDE Group, we are deeply concerned that being a journalist keeps being a very dangerous profession in Malta, even after the government was forced to act in the light of the Daphne Caruana Galizia assassination. The shortcomings that several inquiries have shown how the state has dealt with Mrs. Galicia's murder seems to be unresolved. Without the proper independence of the judiciary in general, and a state that really respects the freedom of the press and protects journalists, the mere gesture of proposing legislation doesn't solve any of Malta's problems. I am sure we will follow the issue thoroughly until both the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia and the guarantees for journalist safety are clarified. To conclude, as the rapporteur for the report on innovative approaches of sexual reproductive health and rights, I underline the concerns expressed in the report about reproductive rights in Malta. Reproductive rights and health are a key aspect of women's rights that need to be improved in Malta as a matter of priority. I believe a lot can be learned by the way Ireland handled the debate on abortion and reproductive health. Thank you.
Next speaker is Mrs. Castel, European Left.
Thank you, Chair. The assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia has helped bring light to many underlying problems within the Maltese institutions. As the report states, corruption, a lack of independence of the judiciary, equality, or the treatment of asylum seekers are some of them. But I would like to focus on 3 issues. The first is the independence of the judiciary. It is important to keep in mind the recommendations of Greco on this, to avoid politicization of justice and guarantee a true separation of powers. We commend the reform of the judicial appointments process on that regard. However, we are still concerned by the control of the government of the civil service by appointment of person of trust. This gives an unworthy image of the country and loses society's trust on their leaders. Second, the freedom of expression, and particularly of press, is of utmost importance for the Council of Europe. The increase of strategic lawsuits against public participation, the SLAPs, is worrisome, and therefore we would like to strongly encourage to look at this closely and particularly follow the Commissioner's recommendations to protect journalists against hate speech. And third, Malta faces a difficult challenge being as a frontline state in the Mediterranean. It is a small country, yet numbers of irregular migrants and asylum seekers is high. The right to seek and enjoy asylum should be provided according to international law. Reports show that migrants are still put in detention in Malta. We recall that this should be an exceptional measure. In sum, integration principles of humanitarian and human rights law, it is essential and in line with Article 3 of the European Convention. This should be done with the help of human rights and humanitarian agency. While there is no denying that Malta is a democracy, it is of high importance to strengthen its institutions in order to improve the rule of law system. There have been some improvements, but we would also like to encourage our Maltese colleagues to address the remaining serious issues in line with the recommendations of the Venice Commission, Greco, and the Commissioner. To wrap up, we have here at the Council of Europe a wide spectrum of bodies that help us all integrate best practices in different human rights issues. Let's establish a true dialogue with them, learn from them to help implement the necessary reforms and build true democratic countries. It is our obligation. We support and encourage the adoption of this report. Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the rapporteurs.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lord Fawkes, Socialist.
Mr. President, can I also thank the rapporteurs for a very well-balanced report. Like them, the brutal murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia shocked us all. I was at the time the General Rapporteur, your General Rapporteur on media freedom and the safety of journalists. And so I was involved in that capacity, along with other members of the Assembly and with particularly also with the 3 very brave and committed sons of Daphne, in helping to expose the corruption and the crime in Malta at the time. And it wasn't easy for me as a member of the Labour Party, because it's our sister Labour Party who were in power at the time, and as the report says, it's a fairly polarised society in Malta. But it was even more difficult for the really good members of the Labour Party in Malta itself, who were embarrassed by what was being done at the time. And the question before us now is whether politicians in Malta have taken the right steps and are moving in the right direction. And there have been, as the report says, a number of actions already: the Commission on Standards in Public Life, the Whistleblowers Act, the more power to the Ombudsman, the reform of political appointments, and so on. But I think the key to the change is something else. It comes from the people of Malta, because we've had an election, a very recent election, in which there has been dramatic change in Malta, and the people themselves have made the judgment. We now have a new Prime Minister and new ministers who were not involved in the corruption at the time, and who are now ploughing a new positive way forward. And also, I'm glad to say, it's represented by a new delegation here of young, able, committed, honest people who are committed to seeing the way forward, because the voters used the system in Malta. They used it to choose between candidates so that the right Labour candidates were chosen, and between parties, and they returned a Labour government in Malta. And that government needs our support now. I hope we can approve the report, but in doing so, I hope we can take account of the representations from our excellent new delegation here and give Malta every encouragement to continue in the path of reform that it has started so bravely.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mrs. Kakia from Malta. You have the floor.
Mr. President, it is a privilege to be here today amongst all of you, participating in matters which pertain directly to my country. Malta is the smallest EU member state and one of the smallest at Council of Europe level, and we all hold a distinct sense of pride. And so it is extremely significant for us to have such an important role in something so much larger than our small island. I know that my country has been the focus of some attention at European and international level, and today we come bearing good news. During the past months, the Maltese government has been unreservedly committed to enacting a series of wide-reaching reforms to strengthen our democratic and rule of law institutions. From strengthening the independence of the justice system by changing our process of judicial appointments, making it by public call, and in so removing any possible political interference, to changing the procedure of appointment of a number of critical positions. The Chief Justice and the President of Malta now require a 2/3 majority vote in Parliament. The Police Commissioner is also now appointed by a public call and a hearing before the Parliamentary Public Appointments Committee, as well as reforms to the appointment of the Commissioners of the Permanent Commission Against Corruption. We've seen a 25% increase in the prosecution of money laundering as a standalone crime, and a 70% increase when accompanied by another offence. The number of corruption-related prosecutions have also increased threefold in the past 2 years. Mr. President, I cannot possibly give a holistic overview of all the steps the Maltese government has undertaken in the past months and those which are in the pipeline in just 3 minutes, but I believe the message is clear. I would like to thank the rapporteurs for a balanced report which acknowledges the progress that has been made, and I will also unashamedly make the case for more recognition of Malta's efforts to better itself. We welcome genuine criticism, such as this resolution, and as being open to recognizing how to better ourselves will make us stronger. And as a small nation, we have always been driven by ambition, which is why we have grasped the opportunity to take on board and prioritize the various recommendations made to us in the past years. And it is extremely satisfactory to have our efforts recognized both by our peers in this platform and by other significant institutions such as the Financial Action Task Force as recently as last week. I also want to make the case for this resolution to reflect the constitutional amendments made last year, which put in place a gender corrective mechanism, which means that our elections last March have given new life to our political system with the allocation of 12 additional seats for women. Amendments without which I, for one, would not be here today as a Member of Parliament. And while I do believe that there is so much more to be done to strengthen women's representation and also in our holistic efforts to improve our electoral system, I think we can agree that it is always a step in the right direction to have more women calling the shots. And so, to conclude, I stand here today speaking with pride, with satisfaction and conviction about my country and the government's intention to keep working to protect and uphold the fundamental values of human rights, democracy and rule of law, values which unite us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Fenech.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is my pleasure to address this Assembly this morning, discussing the resolution relating to the honouring of membership obligations to the Council of Europe by Malta. This resolution acknowledges recent developments in Malta, which led to an increase of women representation in Maltese Parliament. It acknowledges improvement in the selection process of members of the judiciary and emphasises that the illegal immigration remains a challenge for our island, which demands support and the sharing of the burden by all European states. The resolution, however, highlights other matters. The report shares the preoccupation of my party, the opposition party in Malta, with regards to the collapse of the rule of law and the culture of impunity which has taken over our country. This report in front of us comes in the wake of the assassination of journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia in 2017. It comes hot on the heels of the publication of the report of the public inquiry set up a good 2 years after the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia, following pressure made by none other than the Council of Europe and so many other entities. The public inquiry concluded that Maltese state should shoulder the responsibility for the journalist's murder. The state should acknowledge the grave shortcomings of the then Prime Minister Joseph Muscat's administration leading up to the 2017 car bombing. Moreover, the said inquiry concluded that the police and the relevant authorities should continue, or rather start, their investigations to ensure anyone, indeed everyone, involved in the assassination is held accountable. Notwithstanding the conclusions of the public inquiry, to date, not much progress has been made to ensure justice for Daphne Caruana Galizia and, moreover, justice on all the scandals and corruption exposed by the journalist. To date, all government politicians and ex-politicians, including ministers and the ex-prime minister, under whose watch a hostile, orchestrated atmosphere was created against Daphne Caruana Galizia, have evaded justice. Today, nearly 5 years after the assassination, the criminal proceedings against the alleged masterminds and executors linger on slowly in our criminal court with no end in sight. It is in this context that I address the Parliamentary Assembly this morning. The resolution in front of us highlights the situation of the Maltese members of Parliament who to date are part-time members having to juggle between their primary employment and their parliamentary commitments. Being a member of Parliament myself, sitting on the opposition benches, I can attest on a first-hand basis as to the lack of resources and support members of Parliament Malta have, with members sitting on the opposition benches having no resources and support in performing our duties, primarily scrutinising the works of the executive in a system of checks and balances. This report also highlights the control the Prime Minister of Malta still has over the civil service. Unfortunately, to date, the Maltese government lacks the political will to ensure that our civil service functions impartially, away from partisan politics, away from strict partisan decisions. The report in front of us commends the progress made in recent reforms that has strengthened the position of the independence of the Ombudsman, who performs an important institutional oversight function of the authorities. However, it regrets the limited follow-up given by Parliament and the Executive. Mr. President, I share these concerns. I conclude this short speech by congratulating the Monitoring Committee in the preparation of this report. On our part, as the opposition in Malta, we shall continue our relentless work to ensure that all the values of the Council of Europe, foremost of which the values of justice, transparency, accountability, good governance and the rules of law, are enhanced by Malta as a member of the Council of Europe since 1965. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Chope.
Mr. President, like most citizens of the United Kingdom, I've got immense respect and sympathy for Malta and the people of Malta. And we in the United Kingdom don't forget that Malta won the George Cross because of the immensely important part it played in the Second World War in helping to defeat Hitler and the Nazis. And therefore, it's sad to have seen the difficulties that Malta has faced, but it's very encouraging to follow two speakers from the Maltese Parliament and to know that there is, in a sense, a fresh approach now being taken. I share very much the view of my colleague, Lord Fawkes, who's not in the same party as me, but I think that we should be respecting the democracy in Malta. It has shown that it's got resilience, it's elected a new parliament, and I hope that we can show our solidarity with the decision of the people in Malta by accepting Amendment 4, which is signed not only by the leader of the Maltese delegation, but also a number of members of the Labour Party in this assembly. And what that amendment seeks to do is to be less prescriptive And instead of calling upon the Maltese Parliament to do various things, it encourages them to do various things. And the reason that I would support that amendment is because I don't think we should be prescriptive. And certainly from the United Kingdom experience, there could well be unintended consequences if, for example, you prevented all members of the Parliament from having outside employment and other sources of employment, because that can create a dependency culture and actually promote what we're trying to stop, which is corruption by those in charge. And similarly, I think that abolishing the constitutional requirement that stipulates that ministers must be members of Parliament could again lead to unintended consequences. And there have been calls for that to happen in the United Kingdom, but they've so far sensibly been resisted. And likewise, introducing public financing for political parties with a view to reducing their dependency on private donations. But again, that would be open to a lot of potential corruption and the creation of what we might describe as the blob, which is a group of unelected bureaucrats dictating to the people, quite often in defiance of the wishes of those people as set out in their democratic decisions, as we've heard recently. So I have massive sympathy for Malta and its people and its parliamentarians, but I don't think we should be undermining those parliamentarians. We should be respecting them, and I hope supporting the amendments.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Le Nay.
Monsieur le Président, je voudrais remercier nos collègues Bernard Fournier et Georges Loukaides pour ce rapport très complet qui permet de faire le point sur la situation à Malte. L'assassinat de la journaliste Daphne Caruana Galizia a marqué les esprits et mis en évidence les difficultés des journalistes dans ce pays. En effet, la plupart des médias privés sont liés à un parti politique et les médias publics sont considérés comme la voix du gouvernement. Cette situation limite la capacité des journalistes à enquêter sur des cas de corruption dans le monde politique. L'enquête sur l'assassinat semblait dès lors bien mal partie. Notre Assemblée avait adopté une résolution appelant à faire toute la lumière sur ce crime. Je me réjouis de constater qu'une commission d'enquête publique indépendante a été créée à cette fin, conformément à nos recommandations. En parallèle, les autorités maltaises ont entrepris un certain nombre de réformes pour remédier aux insuffisances touchant le fonctionnement des institutions, et notamment l'indépendance de la justice. Si l'on peut se féliciter de ces réformes, elles restent toutefois insuffisantes. Ainsi, du fonctionnement du Parlement, comme le souligne le rapport, il apparaît nécessaire de limiter la possibilité pour les députés d'occuper un emploi secondaire, afin de permettre au Parlement d'exercer un véritable contrôle parlementaire de l'exécutif, et ce, à plein temps. En outre, un financement public des partis politiques devrait être mis en place pour réduire leur dépendance aux dons privés, ce qui permettra de limiter le risque de conflit d'intérêts et de corruption. Par ailleurs, les réformes relatives à l'institution judiciaire devront être poursuivies pour renforcer l'indépendance et l'impartialité des juges. Il faut en finir avec le sentiment d'impunité dont bénéficient les personnes proches du pouvoir politique. Ces réformes apparaissent réellement indispensables dans un pays où la lutte contre la corruption doit être une obsession permanente en raison de la structure de l'économie maltaise. En effet, les jeux d'argent et les services financiers attirent beaucoup de personnes soucieuses de blanchir de l'argent. Les organes du Conseil de l'Europe, tels que le Greco et Moneyval, doivent pouvoir fournir des recommandations à Malte pour lutter contre la corruption et le blanchiment d'argent. En parallèle, les autorités maltaises devraient réformer la législation réprimant la diffamation, qui est en réalité utilisée aujourd'hui pour faire taire les journalistes. En effet, la liberté de la presse est indispensable pour permettre le développement de l'état de droit. Les recommandations de notre Assemblée sur cette question devraient être mises en œuvre. Je voterai donc le projet de résolution qui nous est présenté aujourd'hui.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Bonnet.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, I am proud and honored to address you and this historic chamber
for the first time as a Maltese representative. I am very proud to be Maltese, a country no larger than most villages in any other member state with very limited resources, whose main resource was and still is the intellect, the resilience, and the strong will of its people. Over centuries, this people has punched above its weight, fought for freedom in Europe, gained independence, freedom, and built a strong democracy. A democracy which has led the small island to become a respected partner in supranational institutions, such as the United Nations, Council of Europe, and the European Union. I am here today representing a parliament, a government, elected by these hardworking people. A government that has been overwhelmingly confirmed in power recently with a clear mandate to carry on implementing reforms, where fundamental concepts such as the rule of law, the fight against financial crime, and the freedom of the press are at the heart and constitute the foundation for the country's legislative program for the next 5 years. A government that, notwithstanding the COVID-19 pandemic and the current Russian aggression of the Ukraine, is presiding over a strong economy, with a growth of 7.6% of the national GDP recorded just last week. Record unemployment levels set at 3%. A strong welfare state where health and education are provided free of charge, and the country at the forefront and leading in the recognition of civil liberties, LGBTI rights, and equality. Of course, I know I don't live in a perfect country. The homicide of journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia remains a black mark in the modern history of Malta. And as a government, we are striving to use all our resources to strengthen our institutions and protect the right of journalists to speak and criticize the government without fear or interference. To this end, since January 2020, we have strived to implement the recommendations made by esteemed institutions, such as Greco, the Venice Commission, and Manival, which have led to important reforms, such as the strengthening of the Financial Intelligence Analysis Unit, tasked with investigating cases of money laundering with maximum financial and personnel resources. Prime Minister Abela himself has ceded willingly powers that for decades were constitutionally exclusive to the Prime Minister. Today, members of the judiciary are solely appointed by the judiciary. The President of Malta, in a couple of years' time, will be appointed by 2/3 of Parliament, and the Commissioner of Police was also appointed by Parliament. These and other reforms carried out in just 2 years have led to last Friday's decision by the FATF plenary to remove Malta from its grey list in less than a year, confirming that Malta is a serious and trustworthy jurisdiction, recognizing the efforts of the government in swiftly tackling the issues at hand, with a determination to make Malta's institutions stronger and better equipped to fight money laundering and the funding of terrorism. Although we are extremely satisfied with these results, we recognize that more needs to be done, and the government is determined to deliver on its commitments with the Council of Europe and the people of Malta. In particular, the enactment of anti-SLAPP legislation and the removal of the obligation on journalists to pay court expenses at the initial stage of libel proceedings, which law is expected to be tabled in Parliament soon. I hope we can have a mature debate where partisan convenience, as unfortunately has been the norm with our opposition in recent years, gives way to the objective realization that our country really comes first and before anything else. In the light of the work carried out by my government and results achieved as recognized by the draft resolution, I am humbly requesting this hemicycle to recognize Malta's efforts in the past 2 years in implementing these reforms. I plead with you to give us the impetus as our European partners to feel your support as we strive to modernize our country. This is why I'm asking you to accept the amendments proposed. These amendments are honest in accepting the fact that work indeed still needs to be done, which work we are committed to carry out. But it will also give us a resolution that recognizes that the Malta you are witnessing today is a much stronger democracy, a much stronger European partner, and a much stronger advocate for the rule of law. Thank you very much.
And the last speaker is Mr. Rice.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, chers collègues. Tout d'abord, merci aux rapporteurs Bernard Fournier et Georges Loukaides pour leur travail sur le respect des valeurs du Conseil de l'Europe à Malte. Comme viennent de l'évoquer les orateurs précédents, l'assassinat de la journaliste Daphne Caruana Galizia est un événement dramatique qui a fait l'objet de plusieurs rapports. Une commission indépendante a dénoncé une culture d'impunité conjuguée à une omerta institutionnelle. La PCE et la Commission de Venise ont mis en évidence un dysfonctionnement des institutions maltaises et de l'état de droit. Des réformes ont été entreprises concernant l'indépendance de la justice et les procédures de nomination aux fonctions officielles, mais je pense qu'elles restent insuffisantes. La corruption constitue toujours une menace omniprésente pour la démocratie maltaise. L'exercice du mandat parlementaire à temps partiel reste problématique. Il limite en effet les initiatives législatives et le contrôle parlementaire ouvre la voie à des conflits d'intérêts et à la corruption, les députés devant exercer un emploi secondaire parallèlement à leur fonction d'élu. La fonction publique est également gangrénée par la corruption. Les procédures légales de désignation sont fréquemment contournées et un nombre excessivement élevé de personnes obtiennent un poste pour des raisons politiques. Enfin, le programme d'accession à la citoyenneté par l'investissement, mis en place en 2014, est aussi propice au blanchiment d'argent et à la corruption. Une évolution de la législation en faveur d'un meilleur contrôle anticorruption s'avère donc absolument nécessaire, faute de quoi les bases de la démocratie seront progressivement détruites. La presse constitue un autre point de fragilité. La loi sur la liberté d'information n'est pas appliquée. Les journalistes font toujours l'objet de menaces. Ils sont réduits au silence par l'utilisation abusive de la législation anti-diffamation. La presse n'est pas pluraliste, elle est excessivement polarisée. La création d'un comité d'experts visant à renforcer la liberté des médias ne peut donc qu'être saluée. Enfin, si de nombreux progrès ont été réalisés en matière d'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes, il reste beaucoup à faire. L'avortement reste totalement interdit, y compris en cas de viol ou de danger pour la mère. La République de Malte, qui est membre du Conseil de l'Europe depuis 1965, doit encore impérativement progresser en matière de droits des femmes. Je voterai bien évidemment en faveur de la résolution qui nous est soumise. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, colleagues. That concludes the list of speakers. And now I call on Mr. Lukaides and Mr. Fournier, co-rapporteurs, to reply. You have 5 minutes in total. Mr. Fournier, you have the floor.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Moi, je ne prendrai que très brièvement la parole pour remercier très sincèrement, très chaleureusement les différents collègues qui sont intervenus au cours de cette séance et pour les remarques qu'ils ont formulées. Je note que la plupart des intervenants sont favorables au rapport que nous vous présentons et c'est une source de satisfaction pour nous avec George. Plusieurs sujets sont revenus à juste titre au cours de ces discussions. Je note notamment le droit des femmes, le courage aussi de Malte pour l'accueil des migrants, un petit pays qui est submergé par l'arrivée des migrants et qui le fait dans les meilleures des conditions. La liberté de la presse est assez souvent revenue dans les discussions. Et puis également, et je pourrais peut-être terminer par là, la consolidation en quelque sorte du mandat de député avec les propositions qui sont formulées. Voilà, mesdames et messieurs, ce que je souhaitais simplement rajouter puisque je sens une certaine unanimité sur le rapport que nous vous présentons avec mon collègue George.
I will speak in Greek. Συνεχίζοντας από εκεί που έμεινε ο συνάδελφος ο Μπερνάρτ, θα ήθελα και εγώ να ευχαριστήσω θερμά όσους παρευρίσκονται, αλλά ιδιαίτερα όσους συμμετείχαν στη σημερινή συζήτηση και έχουν συμβάλει με τις παρεμβάσεις τους στην ανάδειξη πλήστων τόσων, σχεδόν όλων των ζητημάτων που αναφέρονται στην έκθεση μας. Θέλω να αναφερθώ ειδικότερα σε κάποια σημεία των παρεμβάσεων, όχι εξαντλητικά και σίγουρα όχι σε όλα όσα έχουν αναφερθεί και κινούνται και ευθυγραμμίζονται και εναρμονίζονται με τα ευρήματα της έκθεσης μας. Επιτρέψτε μου να ξεκινήσω με μια θετική παρατήρηση που έχει να κάνει με τα δικαιώματα των LGBTI. Η αλήθεια είναι ότι η κατάσταση για τα δικαιώματα των LGBTI στη Μάλτα είναι πολύ καλύτερη συγκρινόμενη με άλλα μέλη του Συμβουλίου. Και αυτό που μας έχει λεχθεί είναι ότι ακριβώς θα μπορούσε να αποτελέσει ένα θετικό παράδειγμα για να γίνει το αντίστοιχο και σε ό,τι αφορά τα δικαιώματα των γυναικών στη Μάλτα. Και ήταν ένα παράδειγμα που μας έφεραν οι γυναικείες οργανώσεις με τις οποίες είχαμε συναντήσεις. Και εκεί έχουμε δρόμο να διανύσουμε, σε ό,τι αφορά δηλαδή τα ζητήματα της έμφυλης ισότητας. Σε ό,τι αφορά κάποιες παρατηρήσεις που έχουν γίνει για το γεγονός ότι έχουμε ένα πολύ μεγάλο αριθμό μελών του Κοινοβουλίου που είναι ταυτόχρονα και μέλη της κυβέρνησης και ότι αυτό δημιουργεί την πιθανότητα να έχουμε σύγκρουση συμφερόντων. Πρέπει να έχουμε υπόψη μας τις πραγματικότητες που ισχύουν σε κάθε χώρα. Αυτό που ισχύει στη Μάλτα σήμερα και σίγουρα δεν είναι το ανάλογο στο Ηνωμένο Βασίλειο, είναι ότι περίπου το 1 τρίτο των μελών του Κοινοβουλίου είναι και στελέχη της κυβέρνησης. Αυτός ο αριθμός για το Ηνωμένο Βασίλειο θα σημαίνει ότι περίπου 200 μέλη του Κοινοβουλίου θα ήταν μέλη της κυβέρνησης. Οπότε δεν έχουμε τα ίδια μεγέθη. Υπάρχει σημαντική ανάγκη να ενδυναμώσουμε το Κοινοβούλιο, τον ελεγκτικό του ρόλο απέναντι στην κυβέρνηση, αλλά και τις νομοθετικές πρωτοβουλίες που πρέπει να αναλαμβάνονται από το Κοινοβούλιο, που σήμερα υστερούν. Σε ό,τι αφορά επίσης το ζήτημα της οικονομικής στήριξης προς τα κόμματα, της κρατικής χορηγίας. Και εδώ πρέπει να υπάρχει μια ισορροπία, προφανώς. Δεν εισηγούμαστε ότι θα πρέπει να υπάρχει πλήρης κρατική στήριξη για τις ανάγκες των κομμάτων σε ό,τι αφορά τη λειτουργία τους. Αναζητούμε την ισορροπία ανάμεσα στην κρατική χορηγία και τις ιδιωτικές συνεισφορές. Ούτε και η Γκρέκο εισηγείται κάτι ανάλογο. Όμως εδώ αυτό που χρειάζεται είναι περισσότερη κρατική χορηγία, γιατί εδώ είναι που έχει χαθεί η ισορροπία. Νομίζω δεν χρειάζεται να επεκταθώ. Συμφωνούμε πλήρως με τα πλήστα όσα έχουν λεχθεί από τους συναδέλφους. Θέλω ξανά να σας ευχαριστήσω για τη συμμετοχή σας και θέλω και με τη σειρά μου να καλωσορίσω τα νέα μέλη της αντιπροσωπείας της Μάλτας που είναι σήμερα μαζί μας και να τους ευχαριστήσω επίσης για τη συνεργασία τους.
Does the Vice Chairperson of the committee, Mr. Saidov, wish to speak? You have the floor.
Dear Mr. Chair, dear colleagues, it's a really great pleasure for the Monitoring Committee to present the report on the honoring of membership obligations by Malta. This report has been prepared in the framework of the period review of the Monitoring Committee of the honoring of membership obligations by all Council of Europe member states. The procedure ensures that the Assembly, through its Monitoring Committee, will monitor the honoring of membership obligations by all member states of the Council of Europe, and not only by those under a full monitoring procedure, which is very, very important. In their report, the two respectable rapporteurs have given a succinct overview of the functioning of the democratic and the rule of law institutions in Malta. They have highlighted the achievements, but also the challenges faced by these institutions and have given recommendations to strengthen their functioning. The rapporteurs have strived to give the balanced overview that considers the inputs of the different stakeholders and institutions they met during their visit to Malta last October. And I think, as a representative of the committee, they have succeeded in this task. I therefore ask you to support the resolution that is presented to you, and in particular the recommendations that aim to strengthen the Maltese Parliament and its functioning, which are the core of the work of our Assembly. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Saidov. The Monitoring Committee, dear colleagues, has presented a draft resolution to which 10 amendments have been tabled. They will be taken in the order in which they appear in the compendium. I remind you that the speeches on amendments are limited to 30 seconds. I understand that the Vice Chairperson of the Monitoring Committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that Amendment 2 to the draft resolution, which unanimously approved by the committee, should be declared as agreed by the Assembly. Is that so? Thank you very much. Are there any objections? There is no objection. I declare that Amendment 2 to the draft resolution has been agreed. Any amendment which has been rejected by the committee ceased for report by a two-thirds majority of the votes cast shall not be put to the vote in the plenary and shall be declared as definitively rejected unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the Vice Chairperson of the Monitoring Committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that Amendment 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9 to the draft resolution, which were rejected by the committee with a two-thirds majority, be declared as rejected. Is that so, Mr. Saidov? Thank you very much. I declare these amendments. Does anyone object? As there is no objection, I declare the amendments 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9 to the draft resolution rejected. Dear colleagues, I have received an oral amendment from George Lukaides, which reads as follows in paragraph 1, after the words "findings by this commission," insert the words "published on the 29th of July 2021. The President may accept an oral amendment on the grounds of promoting clarity, accuracy, or conciliation, and if there is not opposition from 10 or more members to it being debated. In my opinion, the oral amendment meets the criteria. Is there any opposition to the amendment being debated? That is not the case. I therefore call Mr. Lukaides to support the oral amendment. You have 30 seconds.
Ευχαριστώ κύριε Πρόεδρε. Εδώ εισηγούμαστε να συμπεριληφθεί αναφορά για το πότε ακριβώς εκδόθηκε η έκθεση της Public Inquiry για το δάφνο της Δάφνη Καρουάρα Καλίσια. Δεν υιοθετούμε την εισήγηση για τροπολογία και έχουμε προβεί σε μια compromise amendment, μια συμβιβαστική πρόταση.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone to speak, wishes to speak against the oral amendment? No. The committee is obviously in favor. I shall put the oral amendment to the vote. The vote is open. Can I close? Okay. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The oral amendment is agreed. Oral Amendment 2. I have received an oral amendment to the English version only from Mr. George Lukaides, which reads as follows in paragraph 4, delete the words "calls upon" and insert "invites." The President may accept an oral amendment on the grounds of promoting clarity, accuracy, or conciliation, and if there is not opposition from 10 or more members to it being debated. In my opinion, the oral amendment meets this criteria. Is there any opposition to the amendment being debated? That is not the case. I therefore call Mr. Lukaides to support the oral amendment. You have 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Και εδώ έχουμε μια συμβιβαστική πρόταση. Όπως υπάρχει και γράφεται η αναφορά στο γαλλικό κείμενο, που είναι προσκαλεί να μεταφέρουμε ακριβώς την ίδια λέξη και στο αγγλικό κείμενο που είναι επίσης προσκαλεί invites. Δηλαδή δεν αποδεχόμαστε τη λέξη ενθαρρύνει που γίνεται εισήγηση για τροποποίηση και αντί αυτής η συμβιβαστική μας πρόταση είναι να συμπεριλάβουμε τη λέξη προσκαλεί invites.
Sounds quite logical. Anyone wishes to speak against? That is not the case. The committee is in favor. Thank you. I shall now put the oral amendment to the vote. The vote is open. I close the vote. I call for the result to be displayed. The oral amendment is agreed. Amendment number 10. I call Mrs. Naomi Kachia to support Amendment 10. You have 30 seconds.
The changes in the Maltese constitution, which resulted in a gender corrective mechanism which allocated additional seats for women in parliament, and we feel that this should be reflected in the text of the resolution.
Thank you very much. I have been informed that Mr. Loukaides wishes to propose an oral sub-amendment as follows. Delete the words that has resulted in 12 additional seats for women, giving a total 22 women MPs out of 79 members of parliament. In my opinion, the oral sub-amendment is in order under our rules. However, do 10 or more members object to the oral sub-amendment? No. Does anyone? Okay, I would like to ask Mr. Loukaides to support his oral sub-amendment. Mr. Loukaides, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are adapting, we do agree with the proposal for amendment, but without getting into details. So the amendment should stay as follows. The Assembly, however, welcomes the amendments to the Constitution to put in place a gender corrective mechanism and its application following the general elections in March that have resulted in 12 additional seats for women. And there we should stop, not include the details that there will be 22 out of 79.
Thank you very much. Does anyone wish to speak against the oral sub-amendment? No. What is the opinion of the mover of the main amendment, Mrs. Kachia? In favor. What is the opinion of the committee? Thank you. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The oral sub-amendment is agreed. We will now consider the main amendment. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? No. What is the opinion of the committee on the amendment?
The committee is in favor unanimously, actually.
Thank you. I shall put Amendment 10 to the vote. The vote is open. I close the vote. Call for the result to be displayed. Amendment 10 is agreed to. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 1554-6 as amended. The vote is open.
And then you finish.
Okay.
Okay, it's good.
The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The draft resolution in document 15/546 is adopted. Thank you very much, colleagues. A big applause. And thank you for your attention. See you later. Thank you so much, Sols. Well done. Thank you. See you. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
The next item of business is the debate on the report ensuring accountability for the downing of flight MH17, which you find in document 15543, to be presented by Ms. Atidis Kolatian on behalf of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights. In order to finish in time for the address from His Majesty, King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands, I will interrupt the list of speakers at about 12:15 to allow time for the reply and the vote. I especially welcome on our gallery a representation of the next of kin who work hard already since years to get justice done to them and all these others who lost loved ones due to the downing of MH17. We are honored that you are our guest here today. I now call Mr. Kolatian, the rapporteur, to open the debate and to present his report. You have 7 minutes, Mr. Kolatian.
Mr. President, colleagues, first of all, I would like also myself to welcome some of the families of the Dutch victims of the flight MH17, which are honoring us today and being present today with us in the Parliamentary Assembly. Colleagues, the report before you is about human tragedy which took the lives of 298 people, including 198 Dutch citizens, 17 nationalities, all in all, including Romanian one, who were on board of the flight MH17 en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. They died an atrocious death because the Russian military provided a Buk anti-aircraft missile battery to their proxies from the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. One of these missiles brought down flight MH17. This has been established beyond reasonable doubts. Who exactly fired the missile? On whose authority? Did they know that they were targeting a civilian airliner? If not, should they have known? And what should be the consequences in terms of individual criminal liability or state responsibility? These questions are the subject of pending court cases in the Netherlands and before competent international instances, as explained in the report before you. During my fact-finding visits to The Hague and Kiev, I was shown much evidence, including intercepted conversations between military units controlled by Russia, between fighters and commanders, photos and videos of the Bak battery as it was transported over the Russian border into separatist-held Ukrainian territory and back again, but with one missile missing, and satellite, radar, and video imagery showing the trajectory of the missile from its launch until it hit the plane. In light of this evidence, I have no doubt, really no doubt whatsoever, that the most convincing scenario by far is that flight MH17 was downed by Bak missile launched by the Russian military units controlled by Russia in the Donbass. I thought for a long time about whether to include this finding in the draft resolution or to say this only in the explanatory report. I decided just before the adoption in the Legal Affairs Committee to include this finding in the draft resolution. An important reason for this is that I believe we owe it to the families of the crash victims to call things by their names. In The Hague, I met with the next of kin of the crash victims. It was one of the most emotionally challenging meetings I have ever attended. Their despair, coupled with dignity, has deeply impressed me and makes me want us to state in the clearest possible terms what has actually happened to flight MH17. I do not believe that this is interference with the independence of the judicial instances that are still grappling with the issues of individual criminal and state responsibility in The Hague and in Strasbourg, as we do not address the detailed legal questions I asked before. The victims' families' suffering has indeed been made worse and prolonged by the different so-called versions spread by Russia. Some mutually exclusive versions were even spread simultaneously with clumsily faked evidence to support them. For example, Russian officials claimed that a Ukrainian Su-25 fighter jet brought down MH17, but it was quickly shown that this ground attack plane does not even have the pressurized cabin needed to fly at this altitude. Then Russia claimed that a Ukrainian MiG-29 had downed MH17, but the MiG would have had to be the size of a football field in relation to other features appearing on the obviously photoshopped satellite picture presented in support of the so-called version. According to another version, a Ukrainian Bak shot down the plane, but there weren't any Ukrainian Bak batteries deployed near the separatist-held territory from where the missile was fired, and the metal chunks found in the wreckage did not match the warhead in use in the Ukrainian forces. Finally, the separatists had no air force at that time. Why should Ukraine have fired off one of its few precious missiles? I could go on and on. One of the key takeaways from my information visits to The Hague and Kiev is the unanimous view of all my interlocutors that the Russian authorities failed to provide data they must have in their possession, such as relevant primary radar data. Also, they were generally not responsive or cooperative, but responded in a dilatory and formalistic manner. I was told that the information submitted by Russia was never sufficient or complete. Sometimes it was plain false. My interlocutors, only bad memories, and the Dutch OVV had even discovered an attempt to hack into its server emanating from a Russian location. My Dutch interlocutors expressed their frustration with the bad faith of their Russian counterparts in even stronger terms than the Ukrainian officials. And I must confess you, colleagues, for your information, that there was no cooperation with the rapporteur from the Russian authorities, only a quite shameful answer coming from the Russian authorities to my request. The victim relatives need to find closure. They need the truth about all the circumstances that allow such a tragedy to happen, and they need a measure of accountability of those responsible. It is my deeply felt wish that the Assembly shall make at least a small contribution to this end today. Thank you.
Thank you, Titus. Thank you, Mr. Rapporteur, for all the work done and for your presentation this morning here in the hemicycle. Now I open the debate, and the first speaker on my list is Mr. Bob van Pereire from the Netherlands, and he speaks on behalf of the European Conservative Groups. Bob, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The report title, Ensuring Accountability for the Downing of Flight MH17, is so correct. And I'm proud to say that, yes, we will ensure that accountability will take place, will continuously take place. It's good to know that the perpetrators of this terrible murder crime will be chastened forever. The least we can do for the relatives of the innocent victims. Also as a lesson that you never escape when you think you can commit crimes on humanity. It's already terrible for the relatives how long it took to come to the conclusion. And still, the chain of command has to be found and punished. It is good to learn that the Council of Europe is continuously behind to support the investigation, as well as the European Court of Human Rights. That there is a great and continuous respect for the relatives. They are here today. Also, it helped a lot that they organized themselves and never gave up. It's great to have today a draft resolution. I ask you all to support this one unanimous. The same country that acts today as a beast in the Ukraine is still working on that way. Their incredible, ruthless behavior brings up a lot of bad emotional memories again for the relatives. Already long ago, they said, to accept barbarism is to invite more. After Crimea, MH17, now today's murderous war in Ukraine. We all have been too naive, but justice shall prevail. Relatives, loved ones cannot say that anymore. Ensuring accountability for the downing of flight MH17, that's what we are here for. We will always support the best outcome, and I'm very happy that our King is also present today to realize what has more and more what has happened. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I close my contribution now.
Bedankt, Bob. Next on the list of speakers is Mr. Kasper Von Nabery from the Netherlands, and he speaks on behalf of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats in Europe. Kasper, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair, esteemed colleagues, the downing of flight MH17 on Thursday, 17 July 2014 was a catastrophic event that took the lives of 298 innocent people and has inflicted wounds in the lives of so many more. It is an event that remains very vivid and painful in the collective memory of the Dutch people. Next to Dutch victims, there were many Malaysian, Australian, Indonesian, British, Belgian and German citizens among the passengers and crew. In light of this, I'm humbled to express my utmost respect to the relatives of victims who are present here this morning on behalf of the entire ALDE group. We want to let you know that we stand shoulder to shoulder with you in your loss, in your grief, and in your frustration. As all the family, we feel this loss also in a direct sense, given that one of the victims of this atrocity, Pim de Kuijer, was a member of our group. Despite his young age, he was a person who commanded respect from everyone for his incredible societal drive and sense of justice. He was active in and around Dutch politics and campaigned in many ways for the rights and interests of people and groups that are vulnerable and underrepresented. He was seen by many as a natural-born leader. Pim will not be forgotten. And similarly, there are countless people in the Netherlands who knew someone in the first or second degree who was involved in this tragedy. And let's not forget that the loss we are talking about today is not only the loss of missing a brother, a daughter, grandchildren, or dear neighbors, but also the loss in the sense of the lack of a universally recognized truth about the circumstances of the downing, the lack of accountability, and the failure of justice up until now. The excellent report by Mr. Korlatian and his fellow contributors demonstrates once more how the Russian authorities failed to cooperate in good faith with the air safety investigation by the Dutch Safety Board and the criminal investigation by the Joint Investigation Team. We are appalled by the way in which the Russian authorities have been frustrating the path to establishing truth and achieving accountability and justice. The ALDE Group is grateful to Mr. Korlatian for his outstanding work and unreservedly endorses the calls in his draft resolution. Thank you.
Dank u wel, Kasper. Now on my list is Mr. George Katrougalis from Greece, and he speaks on behalf of the Unified European Left. George, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and many thanks to Rapporteur, to Titus, for his thorough work. It is not accidental that the two previous speakers are from Netherlands. As already explained by the last speaker, that was a permanent source of grief, this flight in this country, a scar in the national psyche of the Dutch people. But justice is never local, it's universal. And what we are discussing today, it is how the victims of this flight could be vindicated. It is already 8 years, and you know that justice delayed is justice denied. We are closer to the closure. Hopefully, at the end of this year, a Dutch court will give its authoritative judgment on this case. And of course, as already mentioned by Titus in his report, we do not have competence over judicial or criminal issues. But there is not just the legal aspect in this sad affair, it is also the political. Obstruction of justice, misinformation, that concerns all of us. And we must ask from the Committee of Ministers to continue working on this issue from the political viewpoint where they have competence. A last lesson that we can draw from this tragedy is the necessity to reinforce these institutions that have a global jurisdiction over crimes perpetrated like this tragic one. We must reinforce the International Criminal Court. I remind you that important countries like the United States have not yet signed the Statute of Rome. And many of our countries of the Council of Europe have not signed the modification concerning the crime of aggression, something that we see as very pertinent now in Ukraine. So I think that vindication for the victims, for the families that are now in the public gallery, it is our strong condemnation of what's happened, but also a pledge that things like that can never happen in the future. And if they happen, they are going to have a very fair and just punishment.
Thank you very much, George. The next speaker on behalf of political groups is Madam Suna Iversdottir from Iceland, and Suna speaks on behalf of the group of the Socialists, Democrats and Greens. You have the floor, Suna.
Dank u wel, Tini. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, let me first extend my deep and heartfelt condolences to the families and friends of the victims of this terrible, terrible crime. I'm doing this on behalf of myself, but also the Socialists, Democrats, and Greens. And I think it is important that the resolution actually extends the condolences of the Assembly to the family. It is a strong support for how we feel about this horrific event. I would also like to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Titus Corletian, for his excellent work on this report and his delicate approach to this difficult subject matter. I think what this report points out so clearly is why do we have a right to have a fair and effective investigation into events such as these? Why is this a positive obligation to the right to life that we have enshrined in our convention? Because as we know, the second article of our European Convention of Human Rights protects our right to life, but it also entails the positive obligation to conduct an effective investigation into loss of life. And the reason is because it's so important to know why, to know what happened, why 298 lives were lost that day. And this still has not been established. Now I realize, and it is quite clear in Titus's report, that we are not establishing the facts here. But the questions that remain, I think, are very eloquently put in the report, where it states that the questions that the courts need to answer is whether the crew of the Russian Buk knew they were targeting a civilian plane. If not, should they have known? Was their mistake caused by negligent or even reckless behavior? Is the Russian Federation responsible for the actions of the Buk crew, either because it made such a powerful weapon available to unreliable operators, or because the crew members were effectively controlled by or even belonged to the Russian military? How high in the military or political hierarchy does any criminal responsibility reach? Now, although these questions do not fall under our mandate, the fact that our member states have an effective duty to investigate and to cooperate does fall within our mandate. And it just goes to show how important this right is, so that these answers can be, so that these questions can be answered, so that we get an answer to the question, why did this happen? So I thank the rapporteur for this report. I wholeheartedly support it. So does the Socialist Democrats and Greens group. And I deeply hope that we will see justice come to the perpetrators of this heinous act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suna. This concludes the list of speakers on behalf of the political groups, but not before we have listened to Madam Ingrid Schou from Norway. She speaks on behalf of the group of the European People's Party. Ingrid, you have the floor.
President, thank you for giving me the floor. As our EPP spokesperson, Mrs. Ria Oomen-Ruijten, had to return to Netherlands, I will be speaking on behalf of the group. For Ria, coming from Netherlands, the downing of MH17 is a case very close to her heart. Many of her countrymen are still suffering the loss of loved ones. Still, almost 8 years later, relatives of the 298 victims find no peace because the responsible have not been held to account. Today, in the gallery, a delegation of relatives is present. On behalf of Ria and myself and the whole EPP, I offer our sincere condolence. And President, it must be very clear, we must not forget this horrific act. Mr. Collertin has done important work to contribute to holding the responsible accountable. He has shown great sensitivity to suffering of so many innocent people. Justice must be done, and all implicated states must fully cooperate. A major finding of Mr. Leotown is the gross denial and misinformation by the Russian authorities in order to avoid all responsibility. The report and research of the Council of Europe is not meant to repeat the investigations or to influence the still ongoing judicial processes. It was initiated to see if there are obstacles that could hinder the investigation and the procedures that are still ongoing. Such obstacles clearly exist. President, Russia is no longer a member of our organization, but even if no Russian members are here, we can encourage them to take responsibility. We can urge the Russian Federation to cooperate for the bereaved in particular, but for all of us, finding the truth is imperative. I have one question to the rapporteur. The data from AVEX was somewhat ambiguous. If the rapporteur could clarify what he means, is it data which has not yet been made publicly available? I would also like to give credit to Bellingcat, a Netherlands-based investigation journalism group, for their important contribution for finding the truth about HM17. To conclude, I would like to say to the bereaved, you have the right to find the truth, and we, the members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, are standing by your side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid, and we wish well to Madam Ria Oomen-Ruijten, who had to leave us because she was positive with regard to COVID. Now we continue with the rest of the list of speakers, and first and now I call Madam Margrethe Boer from the Netherlands. You have the floor, Margrethe.
Thank you, and I also will start with offer my sincere condolences to the relatives of the victims of the downing. And also, I would like to thank the rapporteur, and not only for his excellent report, but also for his sincere attention to and compassion for the next of kin, with whom he spoke even this morning, I understood. On the role of Russia played in the downing of MH17, as well on its obstruction of the investigation and getting justice, the report is as clear as it can be at this point. More clarity will hopefully follow soon with the rulings of the Dutch and European courts. At the time of the downing of MH17, I was a member of the Dutch Senate, as was our president, Mr. Tini Cox, and I would like to use my speaking time to cite some parts of a speech by the chair of the Dutch Senate on September 9, 2017. The disaster with flight MH17 fills our entire society with shock and horror. Today, at the beginning of the first plenary session after the recess, we reflect on the horrific catastrophe and the great loss of so many loved ones. On behalf of the Senate, I express the hope that everyone who has lost loved ones so abruptly as a result of this terrible accident may find the strength to give the great sadness a place next to all good memories. Among the victims of the disaster was our much loved and respected colleague Willem Witteveen. Together with his wife Lidwien and daughter Marit, he was on his way to his holiday destination in Bali. All three died horribly. As a result, our chamber also became an environment in which a great loss is felt immediately and nearby. The death of Willem, Lidwien and Marit deeply shocked and deeply touched the Senate. Professor Willem Witteveen was a member of the Senate for the PvdA, the Dutch Labour Party, for more than 12 years. As late as March this year, our chair said, during the debate on the state of the rule of law, Willem argued in favor of protecting a democratic constitutional state in which citizens can criticize the government and trust that they will be treated fairly. He also stated, the rule of law is not a quiet possession, not a house in which we can sleep lighthearted. And our chair then ended, July 17, 2014 is a day that will forever be etched in our collective memory. A day that claimed so many innocent victims and that forever marked the lives of many families. They are and will remain in our thoughts. And today, these words have not lost any of its meaning. Thank you.
Dank u wel, Margreet. Next on my list is Mr. Yuri Kamalchuk from Ukraine. He should be with us online, but that does not function. As Lord Keane has withdrawn from the speakers list, le prochain orateur est Monsieur Jacques Lenay de la France. Jacques, vous avez la parole.
Président, je voudrais tout d'abord féliciter notre collègue Titus Corlatean pour son rapport qui fait le point sur l'ensemble des enquêtes menées à la suite de la destruction à l'est de l'Ukraine du vol MH17 qui se rendait d'Amsterdam à Kuala Lumpur. Ce 17 juillet 2014, ce sont 298 personnes qui ont perdu la vie, dont 198 ressortissants néerlandais. Comme toujours en pareil cas, je mesure la difficulté qu'ont les familles pour lesquelles j'ai une pensée particulière à faire leur deuil. Lorsqu'un tel événement se produit, deux enquêtes parallèles sont diligentées. La première vise à déterminer les causes de la catastrophe et à en tirer les conséquences en matière de sécurité aérienne. La seconde tente d'établir une éventuelle responsabilité pénale des auteurs d'une infraction. La première enquête conclut sans équivoque que le vol MH17 a été abattu par un missile russe. La seconde a conduit à l'inculpation de 4 suspects liés aux milices pro-russes opérant dans l'est de l'Ukraine. Cette enquête a été menée par l'équipe commune d'enquête constituée pour l'occasion, placée sous la direction du ministère public néerlandais, avec la participation des autorités ukrainiennes. Les résultats de cette enquête ont été corroborés par le Bellingcat, un collectif de chercheurs, d'enquêteurs et de journalistes indépendants spécialisés dans la vérification des faits. Dès lors, je suis consterné de voir que la Fédération de Russie continue de nier les faits et refuse de coopérer de bonne foi aux enquêtes menées. Je rappelle tout de même que la Convention de Chicago relative à l'aviation civile internationale rend cette coopération obligatoire. Une nouvelle fois, la Russie refuse de se soumettre aux obligations découlant de conventions qu'elle a pourtant signées. Les changements de version de la Fédération de Russie sont tout simplement navrants et les accusations contre l'Ukraine particulièrement affligeantes. Les preuves mettant en cause la Russie s'accumulent au fur et à mesure des enquêtes. Il est regrettable de constater son obstination à refuser tout dialogue constructif. Des procédures ont été introduites devant la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme par l'Ukraine et les Pays-Bas. Des proches des victimes ont également introduit des requêtes individuelles. Malheureusement, la Russie vient de déclarer qu'elle n'appliquerait pas les arrêts de la Cour, ce qu'elle faisait déjà de manière partielle lorsqu'elle était membre de notre organisation. Néanmoins, ces requêtes doivent être instruites et la justice rendue par une condamnation officielle, même si celle-ci n'est pas suivie de sanctions dans l'immédiat. Nous ne devons pas renoncer à essayer de faire émerger la vérité. À cet égard, les États-Unis d'Amérique et l'OTAN devraient fournir à l'enquête d'équipe commune l'ensemble des informations dont ils disposent. Ceci pourrait aider à faire la lumière sur cette affaire et à identifier l'ensemble des personnes impliquées dans la chaîne de commandement qui a abouti au tir du missile fatal. Dès lors, je soutiens le projet de résolution qui nous est présenté aujourd'hui et profite de cette tribune pour présenter toutes mes condoléances aux familles des victimes.
Merci, Jacques. Next speaker in the debate is Madam Inka Hopsu from Finland. Inka, you have the floor.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, in the presence of relatives of the victims of the downing of flight MH17, let me start by expressing my sincerest condolences. I am deeply saddened by the fact that 8 years after this horrendous tragedy, you have still not been able to have closure. The investigation has dragged as a result of Russia's failure to cooperate in good faith with the joint investigation team. The case is a horrific example of what can happen on the sidelines of conflict. Flying is one of the safest modes of transport. Of course, as with any vehicle, there is always a tiny risk of something going wrong, but being downed by a missile fired from the ground should not be one of them. It is completely unacceptable. It takes the Geneva Conventions of keeping civilians outside of conflict to a whole new level. Missiles are not toys that you can point at any moving objects. They are weapons of warfare. This was cowardice, heinous crime, and those responsible must be punished. There are internationally recognized procedures in place for investigation airline accidents or emergencies, be it large or small. Based on what I have read, we have a clear picture of what happened. Russia's responsibility is unquestionable. The book missile did not fall from the sky in the hands of the separatists. Although Russia did not commit the heinous crime, they have a responsibility to do what it takes to help the investigation move forward so that accountability is ensured. Instead, Russia failed to take responsibility, fabricated evidence, and misled the investigation. All this at the expense of victims' next of kin. The least we can expect is a public apology by Russia. I fully agree with the recommendations in the report and hope that one day soon we can close this case, held accountable those responsible, and allow the families of the victims to move on. Actually, swift investigation and resolution of crimes committed in any conflict or war situations are crucial for reconciliation and closure. It allows people to go on with their lives. I sincerely hope that we will never have to deal with such a case again. Thank you.
Thank you, Inka. Next in the debate, I call Madam Maria Mazzenseva from Ukraine. Maria, you have the floor.
Dank u wel. Thank you, dear President. Dear colleagues, the MH17 monument near Amsterdam Schiphol Airport is a permanent reminder for all of us that there's 298 victims who have suffered the barbarian actions of the country which is not here present with us, thank God, of the Russian Federation, who, as you rightly say, have only one technique: to lie, to misuse the facts, to bring the weapons on the ground, which was Bukhtaran, then bring it out of the territory of the temporarily occupied Ukraine, and to say and accuse that it was Ukrainian government who deliberately so-called targeted the airplane, which was obviously not truth. And the historical moment is there. The largest case of a joint application of the Netherlands and Ukraine against Russia is there in the ECHR. And we have seen families crying at the April sitting of this court, while the representatives of the Russian Federation were continuously lying. So the rapporteur has taken a very exhaustive and very detailed analysis, and thank you, Ms. Titas Karlats, for visiting Ukraine, for meeting with the line authorities who are very deep into the details of these cases. It's not only about colleagues, Netherlands, Ukraine, or the other countries, the families of whom were on board on that tragic date. It's about the justice to prevail, regardless how many crimes Russia is committing. It is not being responsible for neither of those. So this is our chance by passing this important resolution, which digs into the details and supports the families and those who are not anymore with us, which were, of course, children and adults. By finalizing my speech, I would like to say that we are, as the member of the international investigative team, are at most interested that this case brings the best result. Unfortunately, it cannot bring back the lives, but it can bring justice. I salute the rapporteur, and I highly ask you, dear colleagues, to support the amendments proposed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. And the next speaker on the list is Mr. Dimitru Nataluka from Ukraine. Dimitru, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear Mr. Chairman, dear members of the Assembly, dear Mr. Rapporteur. First of all, I would like to express my deepest sympathy to the families of the victims of the crash of the MH17, and believe me, we Ukrainians understand the irreparable pain, loss and anger of the relatives of those whose lives were uninterrupted on that monstrous day of July the 17th in 2014. I want to thank the rapporteur for his work. I think he did an outstanding and a brilliant work. This is my personal opinion. I have no slightest doubt that he was approached to this report as impartially as possible. Indeed, it is impossible to say that the events in this report are described as one-sided, superficial, and in a biased manner. It is a comprehensive document that makes it possible to fully understand who was behind this terrible tragedy. Now, since the first minutes of the crash of flight MH17, the whole world has been asking the following question: who is to blame? Let's go over the plain facts. The Buk missile launcher of the 33rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade of the Russian Army is being transported to the temporary uncontrolled territory. This process is overseen by Colonel General Andrei Burlaka of the Russian Federation State Security Service, FSB. In the Russian-occupied Donetsk region, the process is accompanied by Igor Strelkov, an FSB lieutenant colonel who resigned a year before the conflict began. 3. He is assisted by a former fellow ex-Russian soldier, Sergei Dubinsky. 4. And at the time of the launch, Russian airborne troops Reserve Colonel Oleg Pulatov was near the launcher. 5. Again, a Russian Buk, a high-ranking Russian FSB officer, several Russian militaries that are trying to pass themselves off as rebels at the Donetsk Oblast militia. I have a question: could this have happened without the approval of Russia's top leadership? Could the deadly air defense system have left Russian territory unhindered without the waiving of the leadership? I agree with the speaker that only a court can determine who is guilty, by all means. However, it is our duty to say that Vladimir Putin, together with political and military leadership of Russia, personally bear full responsibility for this, and Russia as a state that organized and supported terror in eastern Ukraine for 8 years. And an equally important question is, could this have been prevented? From the very beginning of the war, we said that Russia was pursuing a barbaric policy towards Ukraine and was a threat to both us and the whole of Europe. We tried to explain that only a Russian defeat, not a ceasefire, could bring security to the region. But many people do not hear us, unfortunately. Russia has not been collectively stopped when it created an armed force on Ukraine territories that exceeded most of Europe's armies in terms of equipment and quantity. This was one of the reasons for the crash of flight MH17. It was the cause of the deaths of 298 innocent people, and as unfortunate as to say, hundreds of civilians are still being killed by Russia, and we have to remember that and do everything we can do to stop it. I have no doubt that the perpetrators will sooner or later face justice, as will the main culprit who is in the Kremlin now. And in the end, I want to tell you about one interesting fact. One of the artillery shells that was delivered as military aid to Ukraine from the Netherlands was written Vrag für MH17, which means revenge for MH17. Today we are taking revenge on the battlefield, and I have no doubt that soon you will avenge your relatives and loved ones in court. Thank you very much, and eternal memory to those who died.
Thank you, Dimitrio. As Mr. Andrei Hunko had to leave early, I now give the floor to Mr. Larry Brock from Canada, our observer state. Larry, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur Président and chers collègues. I'm honored to appear today in person for the first time in this chamber. 8 years ago, a commercial airline carrying 298 people was shot down over eastern Ukraine. Many of the passengers on that flight were from the Netherlands, but there were others from all over the world, including Australia, Malaysia, and my home country, Canada. The downing on the flight was a tragedy for hundreds of families, and 8 years later, we continue to mourn with them. This terrible act was only possible, however, because of other terrible acts, the Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine. Indeed, the downing of flight MH17 proved what the world had long suspected, that Russia had been providing advanced weaponry to the pro-Russian separatist militias. The conclusion of the air safety investigation led by the Netherlands was clear. The flight was shot down by a surface-to-air missile made available by the Russian military. Adding insult to injury, Russia has refused to cooperate with the investigation and has gone so far as to spread disinformation to make the search for the truth even more difficult. These delays and deceptions have caused the friends and families of those that were lost further grief. Despite these challenges, the international community remains united in its mission to ensure accountability for the downing of this flight. More recently, Canada suffered a similar tragedy when flight PS752 was shot down over Iran, causing the deaths of 55 Canadian citizens, 30 permanent residents, and many others. Following this event, Canada launched the Safer Skies initiative to help prevent civilian airliners from being exposed to risks posed by conflict zones. As part of this initiative, countries, organizations, experts, and the civil aviation industry work together to share best practices and information to keep passengers safe. They also advocate for the implementation of relevant international air safety regulations. The next Safer Skies Forum will take place in the Netherlands next year. I thank my Romanian colleague for his efforts and echo the report's call for Russia to cooperate in good faith with the joint investigation team. I will continue to closely follow the ongoing Dutch prosecution of 4 suspects. 8 years later, the eyes of the world are once again on Ukraine as thousands of lives have been lost following the most recent Russian invasion. I support President Tiny Cox's call for Russia to immediately end this war of aggression. Colleagues, we must continue to advocate for a free Ukraine and for justice for families of the MH17 victims. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry, and congratulations with your maiden speech in the hemicycle. And we welcome to let that be followed by many more speeches, as we like to hear also from our observer state and observer parliament and the other side of the big ocean. Before I continue with the list of speakers, I can tell you that we have some additional time available for some extra speakers. So if any one of you wants to also to contribute to the debate, please announce it to me as soon as possible. Now I first give the floor to Madam Vasilenko from Ukraine. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman, and a very big thank you to Mr. Korlatian for your very diligent work on this report. Acknowledging the presence of the family members of some of the deceased today with us in the hemicycle, I just want to say I'm really, truly sorry for your loss, and I'm really, truly sorry that 8 years in, you still do not have closure and justice. This 17th July, we will mark 8 years since the MH17 tragedy. And I remember very well being in Kiev on that day and reading the news of the 298 innocently killed people. And I remember the numbing realization sinking in that there is no way you can hide or run from Russia, from Russia's war and from Russian aggression, and that the only way is to stand up and fight. This report is another evidence of what Russia really is and why we as an international community must do all in our power to stop the aggression and push for justice and accountability. The rapporteur put it excellently in one of the points in the report. The modus operandi of Russia in the MH17 case and beyond is to obfuscate the truth by creating confusion, alternative versions supported by fake evidence with the intention to let the general public tire and end up concluding that there is no truth and that anything can be believed. And Russia now is actually doing exactly that. It is waging a war of attrition in an attempt to make both Ukraine and the West tired, in the hope that the fatigue will lead to any kind of peace treaty, legitimizing the further land grabs that Russia is holding over Ukrainian territory. Today, 20% of Ukrainian territory is under Russian occupation. That is 125,000 square kilometers of land where people live. That is like 3 Switzerlands, 2 Irelands, over half of the UK, 2/3 of Italy. In 2014, Russia got away with Minsk, a quasi-agreement which allowed Russia to hold control over 7% of Ukrainian territory. And the West endorsed that very strange agreement. But in 2022, history must not repeat itself. We must put a firm stop to Russia's aggression, and we must do it together. Ensuring accountability in the MH17 case is a key step in this process of justice. And it is my firm conviction that this report will play a key role in the justice that will be served by the end of this year. As I have time, I'd like to also develop a point that was made yesterday in this hemicycle by a colleague of mine, Mr. Alexei Honcharenko. While Ukraine fights, and Europe and the West stand united in sanctions against Russia, some European companies continue to sell to Russia components used in weapons that kill Ukrainians and prolong the war. These companies that ignore sanctions and trade bans are the Belgian Mühlhausen company, French Thales, German Techlube and German Zoller, and Italian Iveco. How do we know this? Well, basically when Ukrainian army captures Russian drones or armored vehicles or any other armaments, we take them apart. And we find elements, foreign elements, which were produced after the sanctions were introduced and hence sold to Russia after the sanctions were introduced. I urge with this the relevant countries to take action, to conduct investigations, and to serve justice as well. We cannot allow for sanctions to be ignored by certain companies in the interest of business and in the interest of money. And we must stand in this strongly together. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vasilenko. As Madam Sina has indicated that she would prefer to be the last speaker in this debate, I now first ask whether members will use the possibility to participate in this debate at this moment. Feel free to announce, then you can have the floor. If I do not see any, then I give the floor to Madam Petra Stine from the Netherlands.
Well, Mr. President, what a morning. So many words have been said, and my heart goes out to the next of kin in the gallery and to everybody at home who is missing a loved one. And I will start with a story about a loved one who was very dear to many people in my party. Since 2015, the Pim de Kuijer Lecture offers an annual stage for a politician, journalist, activist, or artist who shows that you can put big words such as human rights and democratization into practice at a young age. The lecture is named after Pim de Kuijer from Amsterdam, who died on board a flight MH17 on 17 July 2014 at the age of 32. I was always honored to be the moderator of this lecture. Pim was politically active for my political party, D66, and the ALDE group, and he was a lobbyist for Stop AIDS Now. He previously worked for the European Parliament and was a diplomat for the European Union in Malaysia. As an election observer, he participated in missions in Sierra Leone, Egypt, and Ukraine. Indeed, his career sounds like that career of many of us here in this room. Pim was one of the 298 298 people on the MH17 flight. We've said this number many, many times. And behind this number, there's so many loved ones of the relatives that we're mourning here today. Their family, their friends, colleagues miss their loved ones every second, every day, like the relatives and friends of all the other passengers on that plane. They deserve to know the truth, what happened. They need a measure of accountability of the perpetrators in order to find closure. And this is why we are discussing the report by Mr. Koleatian, ensuring accountability for the downing of flight MH17. Under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, all state parties have the duty to carry out effective investigations to identify and punish those responsible for the loss of life that occurred under their jurisdiction. This is part of our international order to protect human life. Unfortunately, the suffering of the relatives was prolonged and made even worse by outright lies and ever-changing versions of the events that were spread by the Russian authorities. This is indeed the same modus operandi Russia has been using for decades. Among others in Georgia, in the Ukraine, long before 24th of February 2022, in Syria, but also against its own citizens, opposition politicians and human rights activists. And ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, if Putin thought that by doing these horrible actions he would undermine international solidarity, I think here in this House we have proven him wrong. And I'd like to quote part of the conclusion of the excellent report by Mr. Koleatian that is a recommendation for all of us. I quote, "We must continue to resist this perfidious strategy by performing thorough, unbiased research and meticulously documenting evidence, using all the technical tools available to establish the truth and debunk lies. It is clear that we will not be able to have normal relations again with Russia as long as this impunity continues." This last sentence was mine. To conclude, I know that all these investigations and reports and speeches will do nothing to soften the pain of the surviving families, relatives and friends. But I do hope that they will add to the chance that truth and justice will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Petra. That concludes the list of speakers. I now call Mr. Koleatian, the rapporteur, to reply. You have 5 minutes, Titus. But before giving you the floor, Titus, we have the request of His Majesty, the King of the Netherlands, to be present at the end, the closure of this debate. So we interrupt for a moment to welcome the King of the Netherlands, His Majesty, King Willem-Alexander. Yes, dear colleagues, there is a king in the room, but we will, if you allow us, we will continue with the debate on the downing of flight MH17, and we have just given the floor to the rapporteur, Mr. Titus Koleatian. Titus, you have the floor. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Your Majesty, colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank all the colleagues that contributed, and their contributions were extremely important for our debate and for the conclusion of our debate today. And I want especially to thank also, from a human point of view, for the empathy, for the emotions, for the heart that you expressed speaking about this tragedy. My first comment on the substance is related to the question that I received, related to the data available, the level of availability publicity, confidentiality of this data. And I want to state in very clear terms. First of all, there was full cooperation from the Dutch and the Ukrainian authorities, respecting the rules, while respecting the rules. And now I speak in a humble manner as also as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of my country, Romania, working for 28 years in foreign affairs, national security, combating terrorism. I invite you to make the difference between 3 levels of availability or confidentiality of the data. First of all is the documents which are publicly available. You know those documents, Dutch Safety Board, for instance, Bellingcat, all those data that were publicly presented. This was the first level of the sources. Secondly, something that I can describe in general terms as being confidential. And I can assure you that I had access to confidential sources of information according to the rules. You will not see in the report, draft report, and in the draft resolution explicitly mentioning those documents which are protected by confidentiality. But I indicated the type of data and documents and pictures and photos and radar and videos that were available, made available to the rapporteur while respecting the rules. And the third level, which is, of course, confidential. And this is related to the competence of the criminal investigation according to the rules. And I can assure you only about one thing, that according to the Dutch authorities that were leading the criminal investigation, according to the agreement, all the appropriate confidential data that were needed, that were made available to this criminal investigation, also from some other partners or allies. What was important in this work was the fact to work based on the objective data, the concrete objective data, witnesses, videos, things that are objectively correct. And secondly, to try to respect with scrupulosity, and I did it 100%, the independence of the inquiry and the criminal investigation. This was done 100%. Why it is important? It is also important for having a very strong basis for rejecting, and I fully agree with several comments that were made by some of the colleagues, related to the so-called alternative reality that was spread by the Russian authorities all this time, using manipulation, fakes, all sorts of things that we discover that represents the same pattern which is currently used after the Russian aggression against Ukraine, starting with the 24th of February. This is why it's extremely important, and you have the draft report based on such type of objective information and data. Now, I would like to add very fast another 2 elements. You will find in my draft report and the draft resolution, particularly paragraph 14 and paragraph 15, 2 other important elements. And I want just to mention these elements. First is an invitation to the relevant national and international authorities to provide an update to their procedures on overflight of conflict zones in response also to the OVV recommendations. It's extremely important when seeing, I don't want to see in the future, you don't want to see in the future repeating such horrible situations, but if there is a conflict zone, the overflight should be managed in a totally different way. And last but not least, para 15 is a polite invitation addressed to the European Court of Human Rights, to the European judges, to consider granting priority to their applications, the applications that were tabled by Netherlands, by Ukraine, and by the relatives of the victims. I'm saying while respecting the independence of the judges, but I think it's a fundamental interest of the European public order to have a look according to the rules, it's true, but looking to the fact that time is important. And finally, my final comment, I want to thank, first of all, our Dutch and Ukrainian colleagues, members of the Parliamentary Assembly for their support and cooperation, to thank the Dutch and Ukrainian institutions that they fully cooperated with the rapporteur. I want to express my gratitude to His Majesty King Willem-Alexander of Netherlands for being present today with us in the Assembly. And of course, I want to thank especially to the families of the Dutch victims which are present today in the Assembly with us. And I want to remind you one thing. During my visit in The Hague, I was honored by you when you offered me a picture. And on that picture, it's true, it was written the following: to accept barbarism is to invite more. I didn't forget this. And you don't know the fact that since that moment, this became a logo for the rapporteur while working with the team, with the Secretariat, to draft this report and the draft resolution. And colleagues, today, I'm addressing to you, all members of the Parliamentary Assembly, to adopt a common stand, and a common, clear political stand, and to state in very clear terms, we don't accept the barbarism. We reject and condemn the barbarism. And we are decided to use all our democratic, political, and legal tools to ensure that the truth will be delivered, that justice will be made, and the accountability will be indeed guaranteed. And now, colleagues, we have an important vote in front of us, and I invite you to support this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rapporteur, for all the work that you put in and all the efforts that you put into to produce this report to the hemicycle. Does the chairperson of the committee wishes to speak? Monsieur Cottier, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée, Votre Majesté, Madame la Secrétaire Générale, chers et chers collègues. D'abord, comme beaucoup d'entre vous l'ont fait aujourd'hui, j'aimerais saluer la présence des familles, de représentants des familles aujourd'hui avec nous, saluer leur dignité dans ce processus et saluer aussi leur opiniâtreté dans la recherche de la vérité qui leur est due et qui est due aux victimes. Et au nom de la Commission, j'aimerais exprimer nos condoléances les plus sincères aux familles et aux proches, au peuple des Pays-Bas et à Sa Majesté, aux autorités des Pays-Bas, au Parlement des Pays-Bas également, ça a été rappelé, il a été directement touché, ainsi qu'évidemment aux familles, aux proches et aux pays de toutes les autres victimes de 17 nationalités. La recherche de la vérité, c'est ce qu'a fait notre rapporteur de manière là aussi très opiniâtre. Et j'aimerais, au nom de la Commission, remercier Titus Corlatean pour le travail immense qu'il a fourni. Il est allé sur place aux Pays-Bas, cela a été dit, il est aussi allé en Ukraine, peu avant l'invasion, peu avant la guerre d'agression. Il a véritablement mis énormément d'énergie pour rechercher la vérité de la manière la plus objective possible, et cela honore son travail et cela honore notre Commission et notre Assemblée. J'aimerais aussi remercier chacune et chacun et le rapporteur pour la dignité avec laquelle ce débat a été mené aujourd'hui et le travail a été fait aussi dans les discussions en commission. Et notre ami Titus nous a dit tout à l'heure son émotion lorsqu'il avait rencontré les familles des victimes. Il a rappelé son parcours politique. C'est vraiment un politicien qui a connu beaucoup de choses et beaucoup de choses difficiles. Mais il nous l'a rappelé tout à l'heure, c'était un des moments les plus émouvants de son parcours politique. Et je crois que cela marque bien aussi l'émotion que l'on ressent justement dans cette Assemblée aujourd'hui. C'est à l'unanimité que la Commission a soutenu ce projet de résolution qui a été proposé. Et c'est donc à l'unanimité que la Commission, elle aussi, considère que le scénario de loin le plus probable pour ce drame est l'utilisation d'un missile Buk par des unités militaires contrôlées par la Fédération de Russie et armées par la Fédération de Russie. La recherche de la vérité est essentiel. C'est un devoir pour notre Assemblée, c'est un droit pour les victimes et leurs proches. Et l'attitude des autorités russes dans cette affaire, qui n'ont pas coopéré, qui ont eu des manœuvres dilatoires, qui ont même cherché parfois à créer des fausses vérités, des vérités alternatives, comme on le dit parfois, doit nous inquiéter. Elle doit être condamnée par cette Assemblée, elle doit nous inquiéter parce qu'on cherche véritablement là à créer la base pour une possible barbarie. Ce terme a été évoqué et on voit ce même type d'attitude dans la guerre d'agression actuelle en Ukraine. Après des atrocités, on voit cette volonté, cette tentative de fabriquer des fausses informations pour justifier ou pour rejeter la faute sur d'autres, et cela doit être condamné avec la plus grande fermeté. En ne coopérant pas, la Fédération de Russie viole ses obligations internationales, elle viole aussi son devoir moral, et elle crée une souffrance énorme pour les familles des victimes, une souffrance supplémentaire à la souffrance déjà inimaginable qu'elles subissent, en ajoutant des doutes et des difficultés d'avoir une explication claire. Nous aimerions remercier au nom de la Commission le soutien du gouvernement, des autorités des Pays-Bas, le soutien qu'elles ont accordé au travail de notre rapporteur, mais aussi le soutien qui a été accordé aux familles et aux proches des victimes. Nous aimerions remercier également les autorités de l'Australie, de la Malaisie, de la Belgique et de l'Ukraine dans ce travail. Mesdames et Messieurs, Monsieur le Président, Votre Majesté, à la fin, la vérité gagne toujours, et à la fin, nous sommes convaincus que la justice viendra, et c'est dans cet esprit que nous vous demandons d'adopter cette résolution.
Merci, cher Damien. Now the debate is closed. The Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights has presented a draft resolution to which 5 amendments have been tabled. They will be taken in order in which they appear in the compendium. I remind you that speeches on amendments are limited to 30 seconds. I understand that the chairperson of the Committee of Legal Affairs and Human Rights wishes to propose to the Assembly that the amendments 5 to the amendment 5 to the draft resolution, which has unanimously been approved by the committee, should be declared as agreed by the Assembly. I also understand that amendments 3 and 4 were unanimously agreed by the committee, but these will need to be taken individually as they are linked to amendments 1 and 2. Is that so, Monsieur Cotier?
It is so, and in the discussion in the Commission, amendments 1 and 2 has been withdrawn.
Okay. We will see. Does anybody object this procedure? That is not the case. I understand indeed that amendment number 1 has been withdrawn. Is that the case, Madam Mazzenseva?
This is the case in favor of the joint position of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Now I come to amendment number 2, and I also understand that this amendment has been withdrawn. Is that so, Madam Mazzenseva?
Yes. This amendment has been withdrawn, and we think the position of the committee is very balanced and clear in the very final text. Thank you. Dank u wel.
Thank you very much. And then I have to say that as amendment number 4 was unanimously approved by the committee, I declare it agreed. Let's see. And that means that we now can, I'm looking to the chair of the committee as well, we now can proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 15543 as amended. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the results to be displayed. The resolution is adopted unanimously. Congratulations. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. We will continue with our agenda, and the next item of business on our agenda is an address by His Majesty King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands. He is accompanied by the Minister for Legal Protection, by the Dutch Ambassador. I see also that the President of the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities is with us, who happens also to be His Majesty's Commissioner in the beautiful province of Flevoland. And the Dutch Judge, Madam Schokking, is also present at this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, may I now formally welcome to our hemicycle His Majesty King Willem-Alexander from the Netherlands. Your Majesty, welcome to our palace this time, where the Council of Europe presides. We call our palace the European House of Democracy, Human Rights and the Rule of Law. And be welcome in this hemicycle, a place which I like to call a most important agora of parliamentary dialogue and multilateral diplomacy in Europe. We are delighted with your presence here today, and as a Dutchman, of course, I'm even more delighted to welcome my head of state in our assembly, and it's your first appearance here. 20 years ago, in 2002, the then head of state of the Netherlands addressed this assembly, Queen Beatrix, your mother. And more than half a century before that address, in 1948, her mother, your grandmother, then Crown Princess Juliana, becoming Queen Juliana later that year, hosted in the Ridderzaal, in the Hall of Knights, in The Hague, the famous Hague Congress. There, only 3 years after the end of the devastating Second World War that had ruined Europe and killed millions, your grandmother welcomed, together with your grandfather, Prince Bernhard, the founding fathers of what would become, only 1 year later, the Council of Europe. Among the Europeans, your grandmother addressed then in the Hague Congress was Winston Churchill, who chaired the meeting, and many other famous European politicians. To mention a few, Konrad Adenauer, François Mitterrand, Harold Macmillan, Edouard Daladier, Anthony Eden, Paul van Zeeland, and Altiero Spinelli, as well as a broad range of philosophers, journalists, church leaders, lawyers, professors, entrepreneurs, and historians. Together they discussed the future structure and the role of what would become the Council of Europe, and the need to formulate a groundbreaking, binding convention for the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Your Majesty, what was then proposed in The Hague has now become Europe's oldest and broadest treaty organization with 46 member states, aiming to achieve greater unity between its members for the purpose of safeguarding and realizing the ideals and principles which are their common heritage. To quote Article 1 of the Statute of the Council of Europe, and with a unique human rights convention granting fundamental rights and freedoms to all Europeans, and a European Court of Human Rights whose verdicts are binding to all member states. Your Majesty, at the time your mother addressed this assembly, that unity seemed seriously on its way after the accession of the former authoritarian and communist state to this Council of Europe. Queen Beatrix told the Assembly then that the achievements of post-war Europe might seem obvious, but could not be considered the consequences of a fortunate whim or an inevitable historical process. She said, and I quote her, "These are the result of the will and the conviction of the peoples of Europe and of the imagination, courage and perseverance of the leaders of the day." End of quote. Today, Your Majesty, as we are confronted with a horrible war of aggression waged by our former member state, the Russian Federation, against our member state, Ukraine, we are again in dire need of imagination, courage and perseverance to end this war, to restore peace in Ukraine, and to rebuild effective and sustainable multilateralism in Europe, based on respect of the rule of law, human rights, and democracy for all European citizens. Your Majesty, at the upcoming 4th summit of heads of state and government, these issues will surely be at stake. Due to Dutch constitutional relations, it will then probably be the Dutch Prime Minister to represent the Netherlands at that summit. But today, Your Majesty, in our Assembly, the floor will be yours. We are all eager to listen to your wise words in these challenging times. May I please invite you to take the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to find out more about how you do your work in practice. I just attended the conclusion of your deliberations on a subject of exceptional importance to the people of the Netherlands, holding to account those involved in the downing of flight MH17 almost 8 years ago. Our hearts go out to the next of kin. Some are here with us today. And I would like to thank everyone in the Assembly who is working to establish the truth and the Chief Justice. It means a lot to us that our fellow Europeans are as determined as we are to ensure that justice prevails. Brute force and misuse of power can never be allowed to have the last word. That conviction is what inspired the Kingdom of the Netherlands to join with 9 other countries in 1949 to establish the Council of Europe. The seeds for its founding, the President alluded to it, were sown a year earlier, in 1948, at the Congress of Europe, in the Hall of Knights in The Hague. My grandparents hosted the event. Winston Churchill, at that time a parliamentarian just like you, addressed the participants. This is not a movement of parties, but a movement of peoples, he said. No one can suppose that Europe can be united on one party or sectional basis. It must be all for all. All for all. That ideal inspired the founders of the Council of Europe. From the outset, one of the Council's key aims has been to promote unity among its member states. That does not mean that we're always in agreement in Europe. In this Parliamentary Assembly, a wide range of diverging views are expressed. Clashing opinions even. We live on a continent where there are conflicts and confrontations. But we're also a continent that has learned from bitter experience that we have to find a common way of channeling those conflicting views. It is an amazing achievement that 46 countries, large and small, acting of their own free will, have bound themselves to common agreements. For almost 3/4 of a century, the Council of Europe has shown that we do not need to be held hostage by the bitterness and pain of the past. That there's an alternative to violence and tyranny. That it is possible to live together in peace and liberty by ensuring that we always remain in dialogue. That is precisely why such huge shockwaves went through Europe in February, when one of our member states, free, peaceful, and independent Ukraine, was attacked. The Russian invasion is a flagrant violation of everything that our family of European nations stands for. The cynical use of force runs counter to all the fundamental values of which the Council of Europe was built. It is encouraging that your Assembly expressed its support for Ukraine from the very beginning. Europe has been united, in both word and deed, in defending the right of sovereign nations to determine their own futures. Let it be absolutely clear to everyone. We Europeans do not want to set the clock back a century. We do not want to go back to a time in which might was right, or to an era of extreme nationalism, hateful propaganda, and terror. Those ghosts of the past must not be allowed to return. It would be a historic mistake to believe that, in 2022, Europe can be driven apart by force or that violence can be used to deprive a people of their freedom. Ukraine's neighbors deserve great respect for the way in which they immediately sprang into action to receive large numbers of refugees. Many of those refugees want to stay close to home so that they can return as soon as possible. Others have sought safe havens elsewhere in Europe, including in the Netherlands. I have met a number of them and been deeply moved by their stories. Young mothers with small children who hastily packed their belongings into overnight bags. People whose homes were burnt to the ground after being shelled. People who left their businesses behind when they fled. Students who want to return to Ukraine as soon as they can. I've been impressed by the resilience of Ukraine's people in refusing to bow down to force. Their struggle compels us to reflect on our own history and the blessings of liberty and peace. Blessings that we may have taken for granted lately. I've noticed that the conflict has brought memories of the Second World War into sharper focus among the most elderly of my country's people. Anyone who experienced the bombing of Rotterdam as a child in May 1940 will have been chilled to the bone by what the people of Mariupol have had to endure. Particularly at this time, we need to stand together as Europeans. We must realize that we have made tremendous progress in the past 70 years. Step by step, we've worked together to achieve a steadily higher level of protection. The Council of Europe has been one of the key driving forces behind these efforts. You are truly part of a proud history. Take, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. It is an incredible achievement that countries and peoples who fought one another for centuries have come together to protect human dignity and ensure that human rights are respected. Thanks to the Council of Europe, the death penalty has been abolished throughout Europe. Thanks to the Council of Europe, torture is a horror of the past. Thanks to the Council of Europe, efforts are being made to combat human trafficking and violence against women. Let us cherish these achievements. Let us acknowledge the strength of these foundations we have built together. Sometimes it may be tempting to disregard shared standards and cast doubt on the court's authority. In such cases, countries should exercise great care and bear in mind the broader importance of stability and trust within Europe. Each member state has its own responsibility in this respect. It is important that we remain critical of one another, but perhaps most of all, we must have the courage to be critical of ourselves. The Kingdom of the Netherlands welcomes the constructive contribution made by the Council of Europe to improving our legislation and policy. Take the example of the Venice Commission report published last year at the request of the House of Representatives of the States General. The report contained guidance for improving the individual legal protection offered to citizens of the Netherlands. It is good to be open to well-founded suggestions from European experts. When others hold up a mirror, you can learn from what you see. The rule of law never functions perfectly. A state governed by the rule of law is not a state where mistakes are never made, but one where mistakes are learned from, as part of a continuous process of improvement. So there's no need to fear criticism from others. When it comes to integrity, anti-corruption, and the functioning of local and regional democracy, the Netherlands also takes the Council of Europe's suggestions very seriously. In performing its task of protecting human rights, the rule of law and democracy, The Council of Europe has constantly faced new challenges, to which it formulated answers. It began by offering protection for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Later, its protection expanded to rights relating to employment, social protection, healthcare and education, agreements on counterterrorism, protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and protection against sexual exploitation and domestic violence. And now, there are new subjects that require your attention, because they affect the lives and rights of people in Europe. Sometimes these subjects are not yet broadly understood, such as the rise of artificial intelligence. Sometimes their impact is already crystal clear, as with climate change. The Netherlands welcomes the debates within the various Council of Europe bodies about the consequences of climate change for individual rights. Your Assembly is striving to give the subject the attention that it merits, and we fully support you in these efforts. It is essential that we make our economies greener and transform our energy supply, basing it on renewable sources. Europe's citizens are already experiencing for themselves the harmful consequences of rising temperatures, pollution, and drought. So it's only logical that we make this subject one that affects all Europeans, a central focus within the Council of Europe. Another issue that requires fresh focus is the protection of journalists. In 2015, the Council of Europe launched a platform to offer journalists better protection against threats and violence. Responsible journalism is indispensable in a free and democratic state governed by the rule of law. Journalists who work in good faith to expose wrongdoing deserve our support. It is good to see the Council of Europe standing up for them. Mr. President, the Council of Europe is an institution in which free and independent countries strive to bring out the best in one another. That explains its appeal. Within little more than 3 generations, the number of member states has grown from 10 to 46, each of them having joined of their own free will. Doesn't that speak volumes? We've all been impressed by the heroism of the Ukrainian people, who have refused to bow down to force. But let us not underestimate our own strength either. In recent years, I visited many European countries, and I firmly believe that every one of them you can find stories capable of inspiring the entire continent. Take Poland and the United Kingdom, which played such a key role in liberating my country during the Second World War. Our Polish liberators knew that they could not return to their own country, yet still they risked their lives for their fellow Europeans. Take the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and their people's brave battles for freedom, independence, and democracy. Take Portugal, which within 2 generations has developed into a country that is a beacon of openness and tolerance. Take Norway and its tireless efforts to promote the international legal order, broker peace, and build bridges. And take France and Germany. For a long time, they were sworn enemies, and now, for 75 years, they've been the pillars of stability and cooperation in Europe. Your Parliamentary Assembly brings together the perspectives of people from all over Europe. You could say that the Council of Europe is the crowning glory of the long tradition of European humanism that first blossomed during the Renaissance. One of the people who paved the way was Erasmus of Rotterdam. 500 years ago, this great humanist impressed on the powers of Europe that the public interest outweighs individual desires. Urging them to work together, he wrote that they should all join forces to achieve the greatest contentment for them all. It must be all for all, said Winston Churchill, his words spoken in The Hague in 1948, echoed the message of Erasmus. The Council of Europe can continue to count on the support of the Netherlands. I wish you every success as you continue to perform your crucial role as protectors of human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. And I sincerely share your hope that liberty, justice, and cooperation will prevail throughout Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Majesty, for your address to this Assembly. I think it was a good decision to invite you to address our Assembly as the head of state of the Netherlands after these great contributions we had from your grandmother and your mother, so the line continues. We are not going to make appointments for the next head of state because she is still preparing herself. But I think that in your address you touched upon the very issues that we debate here and that will be debated on the upcoming 4th Summit of Heads of States of Government. It is that your reference to the fact that this is not the result of an inevitable historical development, as your mother said here in 2002. No, it is the result of the political will of countries, citizens, politicians, governments, parliamentarians in the whole of Europe. The fact that this organization still stands could be seen as a miracle, but it is there, and it is there to serve the interest of the people of Europe. I think that due to the horrible things that are happening to us, first and foremost, to the citizens and the state of Ukraine, we realize more than ever how important it is that we come together, that we have an effective multilateralism in the whole of Europe. That will be debated on the 4th Summit of Heads of State and Governments, which is now under preparation. I thank you very much for your wise words that you gave to our Assembly. The good news is that we always can read back what someone says, can be used against you, but it can also be used in favor. I think, Your Majesty, this will be used in favor of you, but especially in favor of the Council of Europe and our way forward to really unite Europe on the basis of human rights, the rule of law and democracy. Thank you again for visiting us. I wish you well in the rest of your visit, and I hope you get acquainted with our organization in such a way that you might say in a few years' time, why not come back? Thank you very much.